The Accordionist, The Secret Life of Hans Huberman. There was a young man standing in the kitchen. The key in his hand felt like it was rusting into his palm. He didn't speak anything like hello, or please help, or any other such expected sentence. He asked 2 questions. Question 1, Hans Huberman? Question 2, do you still play the accordion? As he looked uncomfortably at the human shape before him, the young man's voice was scraped out and handed across the dark like it was all that remained of him. Papa, alert and appalled, stepped closer. To the kitchen he whispered, "Of course I do." It all dated back many years to World War I. They're strange, those wars. Full of blood and violence, but also full of stories that are equally difficult to fathom. "It's true," people will mutter. "I don't care if you don't believe me. It was that fox who saved my life," or "They died on either side of me, and I was left standing there, the only one without a bullet between my eyes. Why me? Why me and not them?" Hans Huberman's story was a little like that. When I found it within the book thief's words, I realized that we passed each other once in a while during that period, though neither of us scheduled a meeting. Personally, I had a lot of work to do. As for Hans, I think he was doing his best to avoid me. The first time we were in the vicinity of each other, Hans was 22 years old, fighting in France. The majority of young men in his platoon were eager to fight. Hans wasn't so sure. I had taken a few of them along the way, but you could say I never even came close to touching Hans Huberman. He was either too lucky, or he deserved to live, or there was a good reason for him to live. In the army he didn't stick out at either end. He ran in the middle, climbed in the middle, and could shoot straight enough so as not to affront his superiors. Nor did he excel enough to be one of the first chosen to run straight at me. A small but noteworthy note. I've seen so many young men over the years who think they're running at other young men. They are not. They are running at me. He'd been in the fight for almost 6 months when he ended up in France, where, at face value, a strange event saved his life. Another perspective would suggest that in the nonsense of war it made perfect sense. On the whole, his time in the Great War had astonished him. From the moment he entered the army, it was like a serial. Day after day, after day, after day. The conversation of bullets, resting men, the best dirty jokes in the world, cold sweat, the malignant little friend, outstaying its welcome in the armpits and trousers. He enjoyed the card games the most, followed by the few games of chess, despite being thoroughly pathetic at it, and the music. Always the music. It was a man a year older than himself, a German Jew named Erich Vandenberg, who taught him to play the accordion. The 2 of them gradually became friends due to the fact that neither of them was terribly interested in fighting. They preferred rolling cigarettes to rolling in snow and mud. They preferred shooting craps to shooting bullets. A firm friendship was built on gambling, smoking, and music, not to mention a shared desire for survival. The only trouble with this was that Erich Vandenberg would later be found in several pieces on a grassy hill. His eyes were open and his wedding ring was stolen. I shoveled up his soul with the rest of him, and we drifted away. The horizon was the color of milk, cold and fresh, poured out among the bodies. All that was really left of Erich Vandenberg was a few personal items and a finger-printed accordion. Everything but the instrument was sent home. It was considered too big. Almost with self-reproach, it sat on its makeshift bed at the base camp and was given to his friend Hans Huberman, who had happened to be the only man to survive. He survived like this. He didn't go to battle that day. For that he had Erich Vandenberg to thank, or more to the point, Erich Vandenberg and the sergeant's toothbrush. That particular morning, not too long before they were leaving, Sergeant Stephen Schneider paced into the sleeping quarters and called everyone to attention. He was popular with the men for his sense of humor and practical jokes, but more so for the fact that he never followed anyone into the fire. He always went first. On certain days he was inclined to enter the room of resting men and say something like, "Who comes from pacing?" or "Who's good with mathematics?" or, in the fateful case of Hans Huberman, "Who's got neat handwriting?" No one ever volunteered. Not after the first time he did. On that day, an eager young soldier named Philip Schlink stood proudly up and said, "Yes, sir, I come from pacing." He was promptly handed a toothbrush and told to clean the bathrooms. When the sergeant asked who had the best penmanship, you can surely understand why no one was keen to step forward. They thought they might be the first to receive a full hygiene inspection, or scrub an eccentric lieutenant's trampled boots before they left. "Now, come on," Schneider toyed with them, slapped down with his oil. His hair gleamed, though a small piece was always upright and vigilant at the apex of his head. "At least one of you useless people must be able to write properly." In the distance there was gunfire, and it triggered a reaction. "Look," said Schneider, "this isn't like the others. It will take all morning, maybe longer." He couldn't resist a smile. "Schlink was polishing that bathroom while the rest of you were playing cards, but this time you're going out there." Life, or pride. He was clearly hoping that one of his men would have the intelligence to take life. Erich Vandenberg and Hans Huberman glanced at each other. If someone stepped forward now, the platoon would make his life a living hell for the rest of their time together. No one likes a coward. On the other hand, if someone was to be nominated... Still no one stepped forward, but a voice stooped out and ambled toward the sergeant. It sat at his feet, waiting for a good kicking, and it said, "Huberman, sir." The voice belonged to Erich Vandenberg. He obviously thought that today wasn't the appropriate time for his friend to die. The sergeant paced up and down the passage of soldiers. "Who said that?" He was a superb pacer, Stephen Schneider, a small man who spoke, moved, and acted in a hurry. As he strode up and down the two lines, Hans looked on, waiting for the news. Perhaps one of the nurses was sick and they needed someone to strip and replace bandages on the infected limbs of injured soldiers. Perhaps 1,000 envelopes were needed to be licked and sealed and sent home with death notices inside them. At that moment the voice was put forward again, moving a few others to make themselves heard. "Huberman!" they echoed. Erich even said, "Immaculate handwriting, sir, immaculate." "Well, it's settled then." There was a circular, small-mouthed grin. "Huberman, you're it." The gangly young soldier made his way forward and asked what his duty might be. The sergeant sighed. "The captain needs a few dozen letters written for him. He's got terrible rheumatism in his fingers, or arthritis. You'll be writing them for him." This was no time to argue, especially when Schlink was sent to clean the toilets, and the other one, Flager, nearly killed himself licking envelopes. His tongue was infection blue. "Yes, sir." Hans nodded, and that was the end of it. His writing ability was dubious to say the least, but considered himself lucky. He wrote the letters as best he could while the rest of the men went to battle, and none of them came back. That was the first time Hans Huberman escaped me. The Great War. A second escape was still to come, in 1943 in Essen. 2 wars for 2 escapes. Once young, once middle-aged. Not many men are lucky enough to cheat me twice. He carried the accordion with him during the entirety of the war. When he tracked down the family of Erich Vandenberg in Stuttgart, upon his return, Vandenberg's wife informed him that he could keep it. Her apartment was littered with them, and it upset her too much to look at that one in particular. The others were reminder enough, as was her once shared profession of teaching it. "Oh, he taught me to play," Hans informed her, as though it might help. Perhaps it did, for the devastated woman asked if he could play it for her, and she silently wept as he pressed the buttons and keys of a clumsy Blue Danube waltz. It was her husband's favorite. "You know," Hans explained to her, He saved my life. The light in the room was small and the air restrained. If there's anything you need—" He slid a piece of paper with his name and address on it on the table. "I'm a painter by trade. I'll paint your apartment for free, whenever you like." He knew it was useless compensation, but he offered anyway. The woman took the paper, and not long after, a small child wandered in and sat on her lap. "This is Max," the woman said, but the boy was too young and too shy to say anything. He was skinny, with soft hair, and his thick, murky eyes watched as the stranger played one more song in the heavy room. From face to face he looked as the man played on and the woman wept. The different notes handled her eyes. Such sadness. Hans left. "You never told me," he said to a dead Erich Vandenberg in the Stuttgart skyline. "You never told me you had a son." After a momentary, head-shaken stoppage, Hans returned to Munich, expecting never to hear from these people again. What he didn't know was that the help would most definitely be needed, but not for painting, and not for another 20 years or so. There were a few weeks before he started painting. In the good weather months, he worked vigorously, and even in winter he often said to Rosa that business might not be pouring, but it would at least drizzle now and again. For more than a decade, it worked. Hans and Trudy were born. They grew up making their visits to Papa at work, slapping paint on walls and cleaning brushes. When Hitler rose to power in 1933, though, the painting business fell slightly awry. Hans didn't join the NSDAP like the majority of people did. He put a lot of thought into his decision.